Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and today we're talking about finding a new main for Midnight. I have stubbornly tried to force myself time and time again to like this new version of Enhancement Shaman, and I haven't really been able to do it yet, and as stubborn as I am, even though I'm not fully ready to let it go yet, I need to be honest with myself and accept the fact that the spec is just not what I fell in love with in the War Within. And based on a lot of the comments on my recent videos, I know that I am definitely not alone in that sentiment. So this video is for you guys, the players who feel like their class or spec just isn't clicking the way it used to. And to be clear, this video is not about damage or balance. It's not a tier list, and it's not about what's going to be meta in the next season. This video is about what feels fun and engaging to play in hopes that it can help you find your next main in the new expansion. Now, before I jump into the classes I tested, I wanted to quickly explain what I personally enjoy playing because that context kind of matters a lot. I tend to gravitate towards the faster-paced specs, where the small decisions matter and there's room for mastery and optimization, where pressing the right button at the right time feels really good. But more than anything, I just really dislike downtime or long stretches of filler gameplay. So keep that in mind as I go through these classes. But with that out of the way, let's jump into it. From a pure gameplay perspective, Mage felt really good to play. Arcane and Frost in particular were very engaging. Both specs kept me actively making decisions, and it rarely felt like there was downtime or filler where I was just waiting for something to happen. This actually surprised me because historically I've always been a Fire Mage enjoyer. However, as it stands right now, Fire has left a lot to be desired, getting the same, if not worse, treatment than Elemental Shaman did going into Midnight. One of the biggest strengths of Mage is its spec identity, with each one having its own unique mechanics and little gimmicks that completely change how they play. Arcane, Frost, and Fire don't feel like minor variations of the same rotation, but rather like three genuinely different approaches to the class, which helps Mage keep feeling engaging and fresh even when you swap specs. On top of that, Mage does a good job of communicating how well you're playing. When your things line up and you execute properly, you can immediately feel it, and when you make mistakes, this spec makes that obvious too. I really like that kind of feedback because it makes improvement feel tangible rather than abstract. Alongside that, Mage is also extremely mobile compared to other classes. Thanks to Shimmer, you are rarely ever locked into a single spot or forced to cancel a cast because you need to move. That freedom to reposition without completely breaking your ebb and flow goes a long way towards keeping this gameplay fast and responsive, especially in more movement-heavy encounters. And I know I said I wasn't going to talk about balance or meta, but I have to mention the Mage buff. No matter what any Mage player tells you, Mage is Blizzard's favorite little princess and almost always has at least one spec in the top tier in all types of content. Now, I'm not saying that's why you should play Mage, but it does make it feel a little bit better and more of a safer long-term choice going into Midnight because of it. Shadow Priest is one of those specs that I really wasn't expecting to enjoy, but was pleasantly surprised with how it felt moving into Midnight. I spent most of my time messing around with the Void Weaver setup focused heavily around Void Torrent, and that ended up being a big part of why the spec clicked for me. While I don't necessarily enjoy channeled abilities, the gameplay has a strong sense of rhythm, built around major burst phase with Void Form, and smaller, more frequent burst moments through Void Torrent. The structure gives Shadow really satisfying ebb and flow, and because Void Torrent is such a low cooldown, it never really feels like you're just waiting around for your spec to turn back on. It specializes really well in priority damage and spread cleave, which gives it a really unique damage profile, where you feel impactful on important targets without losing pressure on everything around them, and that made the gameplay feel engaging in a lot of different situations. It helped a lot that Shadow received a lot of quality of life improvements moving into Midnight, specifically around their dot management. Smoother dot upkeep and abilities like Tentacle Slam make the rotation feel much more clean and less clunky, letting you focus more on the decision making instead of maintenance. On top of that, it has solid self-sustain, which helps smooth out mistakes and makes the spec feel a little bit more resilient than you might expect. That said, mobility is still Shadow's greatest weakness. It is arguably one of the least mobile specs in the game, and that can be very obvious in many situations. It does have angelic feathers, and being able to cast Void Torrent while moving does help alleviate this a bit, but positioning still matters a lot, and mistakes can be super punishing if you're not planning ahead. Warlock is a class that initially felt a bit janky to me at first, but the more time I spent with it, the more I grew to enjoy it. Once things started to click, the gameplay really opened up and became incredibly satisfying, even if it's a little simplistic in nature. One of the biggest strengths of Warlock is how distinct each spec feels without ever losing that this is a Warlock vibe. No matter what spec you're playing, you're always planning ahead, committing to decisions, and cashing in on that proper setup, even though the way you do that might change depending upon the spec you choose. I spent most of my time playing Destruction and Affliction, both using the Hellcaller hero talents, and that's where a lot of my fun came from. Being able to dot everything up and slam Malevolence to instantly set up those massive stacks of Wither across your enemies felt incredible, and watching all of those damage ticks start rolling never got old. With Affliction, and specifically the Soul Harvester hero talent, the Seed of Corruption implosions combined with your dot spread always felt amazing as well. Watching everything chain together and explode scratches that perfect setup itch in a big way, especially when you pull it off cleanly. But on top of the gameplay itself, Warlock also brings some fantastic utility which shouldn't be slept on. Between your health stones, gateways, soul stones, portals, curses, and more, you always bring meaningful value to the group no matter what content you're doing. And honestly, what surprised me most about Warlock was that even though it ended up being one of the simpler feeling classes to play overall, it never stopped feeling fun. The payoff and utility combined really come together in a way that helped keep this class engaging at all times. Devourer Demon Hunter ended up being one of the actual most interesting specs I tested, mostly because of how distinct it feels compared to everything else on this list. The constant jumping in and out of melee gives this spec a really fast feel, even though the core gameplay itself is fairly simplistic. One thing I really liked about it is how obvious mastery is with this spec. It's immediately clear how much better the spec performs when you play it well. Clean movement, good positioning, and proper setup all dramatically increase your output, which makes it very easy to tell when you're doing things right. But it also makes it just as easy to tell when you're not. When you make mistakes, it is painfully obvious, and your output takes a noticeable hit. You can very clearly tell the difference between a decent Devourer player and a great one, which is something I personally enjoy a lot about this spec. Even though it's fairly simplistic in nature, the mastery curve makes the gameplay loop feel fulfilling and rewarding when you pull it off properly. Everything builds towards this massive explosive moment with your Void meta, and when you finally hit that window, everything comes together all at once. The build-up and release loop feels great when executed well and really sets this spec's identity apart. And thinking back to it, I think a major reason I enjoyed Devourer and why it felt so good to play was because of its mobility. It's arguably one of the most, if not the most, mobile specs in the game. You're constantly double jumping, backflipping, dashing, and blinking all over the place. That non-stop movement keeps you engaged all the time and makes the spec feel fast, fluid, and aggressive in a way that few other specs can match. And now time for the one and only melee spec on today's list, Enhancement Shaman. This one really wasn't a surprise for me. I've always enjoyed Enhancement. The reason I don't play it very often has much less to do with the spec itself and a lot more to do with the fact that I just usually don't enjoy melee classes. That said, Enhancement is easily one of the most fast-paced specs I tested. It almost never slows down. There's always a button to press, always a shiny button to react to, and basically zero downtime. What really makes Enhancement stand out, though, is how dynamic it feels to play. Your rotation and priorities change depending upon whether or not you're in your cooldowns, and the decisions you make moment to moment actually matter. Small choices can genuinely make or break your output, which keeps the gameplay engaging and demanding in a really fun way. And like Devourer, it's another spec where mastery makes a massive difference. The gap between a good Enhancement player and a great one is immediately noticeable, and the gap comes from that decision making, resource management, and adapting on the fly rather than just following a rigid priority list rotation. So even though I still don't love melee in general, it's really hard to not enjoy Enhancement Shaman. The spec is mechanically interesting in a way that makes me seriously consider it, despite my usual bias against melee classes. But after spending all this time with these classes, the biggest takeaway for me is that there isn't really one clear right answer. Each one of these classes scratches an itch in a different way, whether it be movement, mobility, setup and payoff, or just explosive moments. But what it did really enforce for me is that fun matters a lot. Damage will get tuned, the numbers will change, and the meta will shift, but how a spec feels to play determines whether you actually enjoy logging in day to day. I'm still not 100% sure where I will land in Midnight. I may stick with Elemental Shaman, I might pivot entirely, it's kind of up in the air, but spending this time to actually test these specs instead of just reading patch notes made a huge difference for me, and it's something that I would genuinely recommend for anyone feeling unsure about their main. So if you're in the same spot as I am, don't be afraid to experiment. You might be surprised what ends up clicking. And if something does click, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear what's clicking for the other players out there who are also in the same boat. But that's all I have for today, so thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.